Welcome to Coffee with the Risk Manager, where we share a cup of coffee with colleagues and discuss all things risk management in higher education. My name is Stacie Kroll, and I'm the Managing Director of Gallagher's Higher Education Practice. And I have a special guest today with me. While he's not a bona fide risk manager, he's certainly had a lot of influence on the higher education industry. And I am so excited to have John McLaughlin, Senior Managing Director of our Higher Education Practice, who has recently announced his retirement. So John, tell us a little bit about your career and yourself.
Sure. Well, first, Stace, I'm honored to be asked. It was really nice to be part of this. I think this has been a very interesting series that we've kicked off with Coffee with the Risk Manager. Quick snapshot of my career is, it's really started over 40 years ago with Gallagher, during a time when risk management was just really starting to take hold. And, Gallagher was interested at that time. They really had, under 1,000 employees. And where we were growing was in the public sector and the religious sector. And that's really how I started getting involved in education, is just joining the public. We didn't even call it a public sector or a niche. It was just starting to work in the public entity arena.
That's great. That's great. So we have fun coffee mugs today to celebrate you. And I traveled to Chicago so we could record in person. And my mug has a Chicago hot dog on it. What's on a Chicago hot dog?
Well, that's a good softball question to start. Thank you. But on the Chicago dog, it is tomatoes, onions, relish, sport peppers, and mustard. Never ketchup.
Well, as a ketchup lover on my hot dog, I guess I don't like Chicago hot dogs.
Never ketchup.
Noted. And your mug.
Look at this. I love this. Let the adventure begin.
That's great. That's great. So thank you again. And you had mentioned a little bit about kind of your start with Gallagher and working within the public entities sector. How did that morph into higher ed? How did you get involved in higher education?
It really started with just a focus on educational institutions. I had moved from Chicago, where I started with Gallagher, to start working in the Denver office, working in their risk management department. We had a pretty strong presence in the educational arena, and that just morphed into starting to call colleges and universities. So this was early on. I moved to Denver in '83, so I started working with colleges and universities sort of toward the end of the '80s.
That's great. That's great. So how did a number of clients turn into what we've got today? I mean, 1,500 clients versus the one or two that you referenced in the '80s. How did we get here?
Stace, before we even formed a higher education practice, I think there was a fundamental moment for me about serving higher education institutions. I was working with an institution in the Rocky Mountains, and they had asked questions about, risk management practices in vetting student drivers. And so, I went back and looked at some of the driver recommendations that were put out by Travelers in the Hartford, and I put those together for this meeting that was with the risk manager and the assistant general counsel, attorney in the general counsel's office. And we were sitting where we were going through the recommendations, and I was feeling pretty strong about my recommendations. And the attorney came out and said, John, you obviously don't really understand how higher education institutions would work. And this really would not be possible for us to institute that type of vetting with students. And, it just took me aback. I had 3 hours to drive home. And I just sat there and thought about this and said, I had a really, I think, strong understanding of the insurance coverages in the marketplace for higher education. What I didn't really understand is, how did the institutions really operate? How were decisions made? How did money flow through the higher education institutions? And it was on that drive, I decided we needed to bring people in from the higher education industry. This was now to our Denver office and some other offices working with the higher education. And shortly after that, we hired John Watson from Pepperdine. And that was a fundamental turning point for how Gallagher served the higher education community.
That's great. And what an arc that is if we think about talking about drivers and, the complicated complications we were facing with drivers to now. And it is a crazy environment, isn't it? And we are faced with an onslaught of risks between SAM, cyber, just general market conditions. We've got name, image, likeness. I mean, there's so many things kind of on our front steps. So how do you feel about transitioning in this moment?
There's excitement and trepidation with changing in this. I'm excited to be looking at retirement, but when I think of all the challenges facing higher education institutions, just going back to the story, we'd go back to the Seton Hall dorm fire, which was, this fundamental issue of how we looked at liability risks or an injury to a serious sports injury that happened at another institution here in Chicago, to what we've been faced with now. And the confluence of just some economic challenges facing higher education, along with just some purely risk challenges, with sexual misconduct, cyber, the NIL era. Here, there's unknown risk. That's an area that's intriguing to me, is how is this change with student athletes going to impact risk within higher education institutions?
Yeah, NIL is one that's certainly complicated, that I feel like we're still trying to really wrap our hands around.
Absolutely.
So every day, to that point, even with NIL, every day we're learning something new that we didn't even think of before. I mean, another thing we're talking about right now is war risk, right? I mean, that's something that's on our front door. So how do you think risk managers and institutions, what do they need to do to prepare themselves and to be positioned to be able to combat kind of the ever-growing list of challenges we're facing?
That's a great question. And a lot of this is just thinking deeper about risk. I think the movement to enterprise risk management and really just studying this idea of NIL is a great example. How is this going to play out when you all of a sudden have student athletes that are making 6 figures, 7 figures from their name and image? And what if they're injured on the practice field? How does that injury affect it? What about the revenue streams that they might earn in the future? How is that going to impact higher education? But what I've found interesting over my career is watching the evolution that's just throughout the insurance industry and sophistication of how brokers approach the idea of evaluating and managing risk, and how, particularly in higher education, the amount of effort and attention that we've started to focus on risk management has really been a big shift. I think the one area that it still remains a challenge is the breakdown between the C-suite and the risk management office. And when there's a large reputational event, it seems that risk management gets closed out. And we've got to speak to that on a level that's even above risk management, is we can't have risk managers finding out about a major loss in the paper.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm hopeful and optimistic that the way that we faced COVID will help us kind of bridge that gap, and that we've been brought in to the C-suite a little bit more than I think we have in the past. But I think I agree with you. There's so much more room to do better there. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the market. It's a long career. You've seen a couple dips and swells of the market. Is it really cyclical? How are we feeling about this moment? Is there something we need to be aware of?
Well, I think, history repeats itself. And, we can look at the trends in the hard markets. I've been through 3 of, more than that, 3 or 4 of them during my career. We're starting, I believe, to be on the downside of this hard market. There's new capacity that's come into the marketplace. We're seeing a little more competition in the D&O and educators legal arena, some more on the property side. This market, it will soften, but higher education is going to be lagging. Higher education has had some just significant high-profile losses. On the liability side, I think will be a lagging industry as that market softens.
Thank you for that. So any parting words of wisdom to our audience, risk managers, insurance buyers, other brokers? What's one piece of advice in your career that you want to pass on?
I don't know how much my wisdom is worth, but knowledge travels. This is a message I give to my kids, knowledge travels. And, during my career, I've been a voracious reader of risk issues, you name it, articles on higher education, risk management. And I think it's become much harder now with the so immediate access to, iPads and iPhones, and we all wake up and start looking at our iPhone and our computer instead of just sitting down to read. Yeah. And that used to be part of my career. I'd start the day reading a magazine. I'd spend a half hour just reading. And I think we need to look at that. It's so important to be able to train and educate our young people as they're coming into this business. Really expose them to what's, to me, a fascinating, intricate business of risk management. And it does take a commitment to really learn.
To learn, yeah. And I think we need to let go of the guilt a little bit when we read at our desk instead of answer emails, right?
In the immediacy, I think that's something we have to share with people. The immediacy has become so, significant. I think there has to be a time I have to think. We have to look back and really research this before we give an answer.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So I thank you again for being here. I think I speak on behalf of a lot that your contributions to the industry, your contributions to broking are certainly outnumbered. And this moment in time presents so many opportunities for innovative ways to kind of build upon your foundation of thought leadership. So we really appreciate it.
And Stacie, I think with you and Paul in the leadership of the practice at Gallagher, and really with all my friends and colleagues in the higher education community, we're all well positioned to succeed, and I will miss you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on a Coffee with the Risk
Cheers.
Manager. Cheers.
Happy to.